Well, the word of God today comes from Genesis chapter 42 to 45. Now, I know you know that I like to read a lot of the Bible, but even 4 chapters is pretty ambitious for me. We're not going to read all 4 chapters. I'm going to pick and choose just some important parts of Genesis chapter 42 to 45. So we're looking today at the second half of the Joseph story. So as you know, we've been going through a series in Genesis. We've looked at the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and now we're looking at the life of Joseph. Last week, we looked at the first half of the life of Joseph. Remember that his brothers, when he was 17, sold him to Egypt. He was a servant in Potiphar's house, and he was in prison for 13 years, right? And at 30 years old, he became a ruler in Egypt. And last week, the title of my sermon, that our suffering is not wasted by God. That God, he does not waste suffering. That God always redeems, that God uses suffering. We're going to look at the second half of the Joseph story today. And it starts in chapter 42. So we're going to start by reading Genesis chapter 42, verses 1 to 25. I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to give like a running commentary as we go, and I'm going to ask questions. And so I think we have like 6 non-college students, right? So I've got 3 here. The Ascarios have 2 because, Igan, you're a man, so Ascarios have 2, and then Anise is in the back. So, right? So Anise, she's our 6th. So I'm going to ask questions, and they're not. When I ask a question, it's not going to be a rhetorical question. Okay. So when I ask a question today, I actually want an answer. Okay. So we're going to kind of read through it, and we're going to pause every once in a while, and I'm going to give like a running commentary on it, and then we're going to read, and then at the end of the reading, I'm just going to give 4 points about what we can learn from Joseph and the Bible about suffering well, okay? So Genesis, actually, I do want to start here, though. I want to start in Genesis 37 really quickly. I mentioned this last week or a couple weeks ago. One of the things that you see in the Joseph story is the growth of his brothers. So one thing that's interesting is this story is told from the perspective of Joseph. We know everything that Joseph knows. And so it's very interesting when you read it from that perspective. But you can also read the story and try to understand the story from his brother's perspectives, because his brother's perspective, it's just a little bit different. But again, one of the things that you see in this story is the growth and the maturation of his brothers who sold him to Egypt, right? And so remember I told you that out of the 12 sons of Jacob, the one the promise goes through is Judah, right? And so when I read the story, I really focus on the person of Judah. And in Genesis 37, verse 26, this is what we're told about Judah and what Judah says. Sorry, Genesis 37, verse 26. And then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. So when I first kind of focused on this and I found out that it was Judah's idea to sell his brother Joseph, I was heartbroken. I was like, no, of all the brothers, he should have protected his brother. And it was his idea to sell his brother. Now, where was Joseph when this happened? So this is not a rhetorical question. So one of the 6 of you, where was Joseph when this happened? He was in a hole. He was in the pit. Which I think means he heard Judah say this. I think Joseph heard, and he knew that it was Judah's idea to sell him. If you're Joseph, which of your brothers do you think that you dislike the most? I think if I was angry at any of my brothers, I think I'd be most angry at Judah, because I'm sitting in the pit and I hear him, and it's his idea to sell me. And this is interesting because Judah comes back into the story later. Okay, but you got to remember, this is where it starts. So here we go, Genesis 42, starting in verse 1 to 25. This is the word of God. So when Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." So pause. In the middle there, we're told that their response to their dad saying, "Hey, go, there's grain for sale in Egypt." And we're told that his sons, he says, "Why do you look at one another?" So let me ask you, 11 brothers, their dad brings up grain in Egypt, and the brothers, they just start looking at one another. Why do you think they're looking at one another? I need somebody else. All right, you want to try, Anise? Sorry, because Pharaoh, but they didn't know that, right? So they don't know that yet. So all they know is that there's grain in Egypt. You're warm though. You're not cold. Like you're warm, right? Yeah, they know that they sold their brother to Egypt. And so for them, when they think of Egypt, it's not a good place. It's not like a good memory, and it's not a place that they want to be associated with, right? And you're going to see, as we read the story, they regret their decision. They regret their decision, and there's remorse, and I think they know what they did is wrong. And so when their dad tells them, "Hey, go to Egypt," they're like, it's like if you do something wrong and, like with your siblings, like the son, sisters, I don't know if you ever did anything wrong. And if your parents bring something up, you kind of look at one another like this, right? It's like, that's what they're doing. Verse 3, so 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. Thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. All right, so we've read the first half of the story. I'm going to tell you this is where the story gets really good. I think this is when the story starts to get really good right here. Now, Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. So this is the thing. How old do you think Joseph is when this story takes place? Okay, so you gotta think a little bit, but how old do you think Joseph is when this story takes place? I'm gonna give Carrie a shot. I don't know if you're getting it right. Here we go. Okay, so Elliot says no. So it's a good start. He became ruler of Egypt at 30, but time has passed. Okay, so how much time has passed? Why do you say 10 years? That's a pretty good guess, Daniel. Wow, look at. You think he's 47, okay? So to answer the question, you have to kind of know the story. Remember, Pharaoh had a dream, right? And the dream meant 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. Okay, are they in the plenty or are they in the famine? So that means at least 7 more years has passed, okay? Because they're in the famine now. So for 7 years, Joseph stored up grain. And then if you look on in the story, and you got to know this later, but they're 2 years into the famine. Actually, they're probably about 1 year into the famine here. Okay, they're probably about 1 year into the famine. It just started. So you got to add, he's 30 years old when he becomes ruler of Egypt. 7 years of plenty have passed. Like 38, 39, like something like that, like 38 or 39. Right? That's what I think. A lot of time has passed. But it's interesting, we're told that Joseph, he recognizes them. Now, I don't think he's absolutely certain that these are his brothers, but he has an idea. And so what you're going to see, in the next verses, he's got to find out for sure. Like, he recognizes these 10 guys. They look pretty familiar, but before I deal with them, I've got to make sure that these are the right guys. Okay? So these are the questions that follow. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. And this is the question: where do you come from? They said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. All right, like this greater chance that these are my brothers who sold me, right, into Egypt. And again, we're told, and Joseph recognized his brothers. You understand? He recognized them, but he wasn't absolutely sure. He got confirmation. They're from Canaan, probably my brothers, but they did not recognize him. And then we're told, and Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. This is when all the pieces start coming together. I think this is the clue that everything that he's experienced, from the dreams to a slave in Pharaoh's house, prison, and everything he's gone through, I think the pieces are starting to come together now for Joseph. And Joseph said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." And they said to him, "No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man." Okay, further confirmation, right? 10 brothers, all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies. See, Joseph is just getting more confirmation, okay, that these are the guys who I think they are. 10 brothers, I recognize them from Canaan, okay, all sons of one man. And he said to them, "No, it is the nakedness of the land that you have come to see." And they said, "We, your servants, are 12 brothers." Right? For sure. Like, these are the guys for sure. And it goes on. "We are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is no more." Right? If you're Joseph now, for sure, right? These are the dudes, right? These are the guys that sold me. He knows with absolute certainty. Canaan, one father, 12 brothers, youngest is with our father, one is no more. I mean, how many families can that be? I think it's interesting. That the brothers said that we are 12 brothers. Because if it was me, I would say we are 11 brothers. That's what I would have said. I think it's very interesting that before Joseph, they tell him we are 12 brothers. You know what that means? They haven't forgotten him. I think that speaks to Joseph. They haven't forgotten him. Because easily, I think they could have introduced themselves. We are 11 brothers, and the youngest is with our father. But we are 12. So for sure, he knows that these are the guys that did him wrong. It's been 20 years. He doesn't know who these guys are, but this is all he knows. All he knows is these are the guys who did me wrong, and I don't see my brother. If they did me wrong because they hated me, because my father loved me, then what if they did my brother wrong too? Because they hated him because my dad favored him. You understand? This is what he has to be thinking. These are the guys that did me wrong. Where's my brother? Where's my younger brother? And so he's got to get this answer. Verse 14, "But Joseph said to them, 'It is as I said to you, you are spies.'" And this is interesting. "By this you shall be tested." And he's going to test his brothers. He's going to test their character. "By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you and let him bring your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested," right? is it true that my brother's still alive? That's what he wants to find out. That your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. And he put them all together in custody for 3 days. Okay, so next question. 3 days. What were they talking about for 3 days? What do you think the brothers were talking about for 3 days? I'm going to give you a hint. They had to decide something. For 3 days, I think they were talking about one thing. They had a decision to make. What decision did they have to make? You want to try? All right. Yes. Only one person can go to bring Benjamin back. There's no guarantee that Benjamin's going to come back. As they know how much their dad loves Benjamin. The only person who's going to live through this is the one that leaves. There's the only one that's going to live. You know what they need to decide for 3 days? Like, which one of them is going to go back? I bet they're arguing the entire time. They really are. They're really like, okay, I should go back. No, you should go back. And I don't think they can decide. And so after 3 days, Joseph intervenes. He intervenes and he says, so on the third day, Joseph said to them, and he changes his mind. He says, do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, and let the rest go and carry grain for the famine of your households. And bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified and you shall not die. And they did so. You understand? I mean, they couldn't decide which one was going to go. So Joseph said, fine, I'll let 9 of you go, just 1 of you stay. And Joseph, he's going to choose. And notice who he chooses. Then they said to one another, Joseph is here, okay. They said to one another, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother. There's regret there. There's remorse. In that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us. Remember when we talked about the story, how long do you think Joseph screamed as the traders took him away to Egypt? Like, I would think he probably screamed until he fell asleep. He probably screamed at the top of his lungs, don't do this, right? Save me. They regret. You hear the and Joseph, you understand? Joseph sees that they've changed. Like, there's remorse and there's regret. But then it goes on. And Reuben answered them, did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood. This is really interesting because if you read the story before, we know that Reuben tried to save Joseph, but Joseph doesn't know this. Remember, this happened when Joseph was still far away. They were talking about amongst themselves, let's kill him. And then Reuben steps in and Reuben says, no, don't kill him. Joseph has no idea that Reuben tried to save him. This is the first that he's ever hearing that Reuben tried to save him. Again, he knew that it was Judah's idea, though, to sell him. And it's interesting. They did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them. Then he turned away from them and wept. And just notice, there's a lot of weeping. Joseph, he's a crier, okay? But he wept. And I think it's important. I think it says something. He wept. And he returned to them and spoke to them, and he took Simeon from them and bound them before their eyes. This is a rhetorical question, but why do you think he took Simeon? Like, wouldn't you take Judah? I would take Judah. I'd be like, Judah, you come here, right? If anyone's going to suffer, if I never see these brothers again, if there's one brother that I want next to me suffering, it's Judah. But it's interesting. He chooses Simeon. He doesn't choose Reuben. If I was him, I would be mad at Reuben. Because I'd be like, Reuben, you're the oldest. It was your job to protect me. They would have listened to you. See, before this, Joseph had no idea that Reuben tried to protect him. He might have been mad at Reuben because he's the oldest. But he finds out this new information. Oh man, Reuben tried to save me. He takes Simeon. That's right, because Simeon's the next oldest. That's what I think. Hey, Reuben, okay, you tried to save me. Pass. Simeon, you're next. Like, you failed me, right? I could be wrong, but he takes Simeon. Simeon is the next oldest, bound them before their eyes. And Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to replace every man's money in a sack and to give them provisions for the journey. This was done for them, all right? So I'm going to fast forward. They end up going back to Canaan. They tell their dad what happened, said, hey, we need to go back down with Benjamin. And their dad says, yeah, that's a great idea. Go and save your brother. Like, no. His dad's like, no. My son Benjamin, he's not leaving my side. Time passes. The next chapter, they run out of food. His dad says, hey, go and get more food for us. And they said, we can't. Unless you send Benjamin with us, we can't. We're looking verse chapter 43, starting in verse 8. Remember, Judah shows up to the scene again. I'll be honest, I know the promise goes through Judah, but I'm not a fan of Judah right now, right? Because Judah sold his brother. But Judah said to Israel, his father, send the boy with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you, and also our little ones. I will be a pledge of his safety. From my hand, you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. Like, all right. That's not bad. Now, the question is he really going to do it? Like, if he really has to do it, are these just empty words that he's saying to his dad to manipulate his dad to get him to send Benjamin with him? Or does Judah really mean this? But in any case, this is pretty impressive. That Judah, he steps up and he says to his dad, hey, send him with me. Jump to verse 26. If you jump to verse 26, they get to Egypt. And when Joseph came home, the brothers brought into the house to him the present that they had brought with them and bowed down to him to the ground. And Joseph inquired about their welfare and said, is your father well? The old man of whom you spoke, is he still alive? Again, he doesn't know that. Did they kill their dad? I mean, if they're willing to sell him, did they do something to Benjamin? Did they do something to their dad, right? So is he well? Is he alive? And they said, your servant, our father, is well. He is still alive. And they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves. And he lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son. Then Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother, and he sought a place to weep. And he entered his chamber and wept there. So the story goes on. They eat together, and Joseph, he sends his brothers back, and he sends them back with grain, but he puts his silver cup into Benjamin's bag, and it looks like Benjamin stole his cup. They get caught. So again, Joseph is testing them. He's setting them up. They get caught with Joseph's cup, and Benjamin's the one that gets caught. And they said, we only need Benjamin to come back with us. But all the brothers go back to Egypt. All the brothers go back with Benjamin, and we're in chapter 44. If you look at verses 32 to 34, this is what Judah says. Remember, Benjamin was the one with the cup. Benjamin was going to be a slave in Egypt. And Judah says, this is Judah speaking to Joseph. Judah is the one who sold him. For your servant Judah became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father all my life. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father. I think that's so cool. I think it's so cool to see the growth and the maturity of Judah. The guy who sold his brother is the one who offers to take his place. From Judah comes Jesus. Like you see, like substitution here. Hey, I'll take his place. And when I get to this, I'm like, yes, like finally, it's so good. And then it wraps up, and we're going to end by reading the first 8 verses of chapter 45. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept aloud, so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. It's my father still alive." But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will neither be plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt." I'm going to quickly summarize this. What can we learn? Joseph clearly, he suffers well. I think you would all agree. If Joseph wasn't sold, if he didn't serve in Potiphar's house, if he wasn't in prison, he wouldn't have been able to be the ruler that God wanted him to be. But even when he meets his brother, his demeanor with them, but it seems to me that Joseph has suffered well. And so what are 4 things that I see in Joseph that are keys to suffering well? And so the first is this, is if you want to suffer well, give your suffering to God. Don't hold on to your suffering. Don't keep it bottled up inside. Give your suffering to God. Give it to God. I don't think we're told many times that Joseph wept. I'm not a crier. I'm not, and I try very hard to control my emotions. If you know me, I like control. I like to control on my emotions. But crying, when you weep, weeping is a good thing when you're struggling because it shows that you're letting go. It means that you're not holding on and you're letting it out. You're letting it go. I think one of the keys to suffering well, and one of the things that you see that Joseph does, is he doesn't hold on to his suffering. His suffering doesn't make him bitter, right? He lets it go. So he lets go of his suffering. That's one. But then he clings to God. Let it go, but then cling to God. A lot of times when people suffer, what we do is we let go of God and we cling to our suffering. We bottle it up inside. Give your suffering to God and cling to God. You see Joseph, and one of the things we said about suffering last week is suffering has the unique ability to push us to God. Whenever Joseph speaks, almost always he speaks about God. Joseph, in his suffering, he has let go of his suffering and he's clung to God. So 2 things. Give your suffering to God and then cling to God. Second, what helps us to suffer well, and what can you see in this? We know that God has a plan. In our suffering, we know that God has a plan. One of the best things about going to Providence for me is being surrounded by other just Christian mom and dads. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard parents say to me, "I know that God has a plan." This is when their kids are going through really hard times. I know parents at Providence, their kids struggle with anxiety and depression. They're going through really difficult times. And I'll sit next to them and I'll just listen to them. And they end by saying this, "I know God has a plan. I know that God has a plan." And I can't tell you how many times during our time at Providence, when I've been going through a hard time, somebody would come next to me and say, "Brendon, God has a plan." And that makes all the difference. It makes all the difference to know that in the midst of my suffering, you know what? God has a plan. God isn't finished yet, that God has a plan. When you're suffering, remember that God has a plan. Lastly, what helps us to suffer well? Remember that we have a God who suffers. Remember that God himself suffers. And it's through God's suffering that we are saved. You kind of see it in Joseph's story. As a result of his suffering, many people are saved. His family is saved. But then it really kind of pushes you farther to look to God, that we have a God who suffers. And it's through his sufferings that we're saved. So really 4 quick things. What do I see in the Joseph story? The keys to suffering well. Let go of your suffering. Give it to God. In the midst of it, cling to God. Remember that God has a plan. And remember that we have a God who suffers. I thought a great way to close our service. So how do you do that? How do you give your suffering to God? And how do you cling to God? I think a great way to cling to God is by taking communion. I think it's a great physical way to make a spiritual reality a physical truth, right? To say, God, I want to cling to you. Maybe right now, maybe today, you're experiencing suffering and hardship. And God, help me to cling to you. Well, how do you cling to God? Again, I think one of the ways that we can cling to God is through communion. So as we close our service today, we are going to take communion. As we take communion on this Thanksgiving Sunday, I hope that it helps us to cling to Christ. But I also hope that during this Thanksgiving season that we feast on Christ. As you feast, as our bodies feast on food, that our souls, that we would feast on the riches of Christ. God, thank you for who you are. Thank you that through your sufferings, that we are children of God. Would you help us to cling to you? And God, would you help us to feast on you, especially during this Thanksgiving season? And God, we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks for watching. If you want to hear more good news, be sure to subscribe and join us next Sunday at 10 a.m. And if you live in the Atlanta area, we'd love to have you join us in person. Visit our website for more details. God bless you.